My name's Margot James. I'm I'm chair of WMG, which is part of the University of Warwick, and formerly Conservative MP and Minister. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Andy Street, our Mayor of the West Midlands, who has done an absolutely fantastic job as Mayor and is standing for re-election. And Andy, we wish you all the very best in that endeavour, and we're delighted to have so many people here for this very important Ask Andy session. I'm impressed with the number of Ask Andy sessions that you're running, and I'm absolutely honoured to be invited today to chair this one. So we are going to be talking about the Gigafactory, but first of all, Andy, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Of course. Thank you very much, Margot, and thank you for chairing in a completely impartial and neutral way the next few moments. So just the whole purpose of the Ask Andys. Over the last 4 years, I believe very strongly that I should get out and about and make myself available to citizens across the West Midlands. So I was doing that in church halls, factories, offices, you name it. But obviously, we've had a little stop on that after the pandemic, but I was very, very keen to continue to do that, certainly in the run up to the next election. And we're doing them all virtually. So I'm sitting at home, as you will see, but we thought most of them are done on a geographic basis. So we go to meet the community in X place. But I thought, as this subject is so important, we should have one dedicated to this. And I thought, who better than Margot, given her role, to bring us together? So that's the logic of it all.
Marvellous. Okay, Andy, well, thank you for that. And well, let's get started. You've been campaigning for a Gigafactory for quite a long time now, I know. What's it all about? What does it mean to you?
So, yeah, very happy to answer that. I should probably say, for those on the line, I know none of the questions that are going to be asked of me. This is always spontaneous, both from what Margot might say and indeed what those on the line will say as well. And I always enjoy the spontaneity of it. But anyway, let's get straight to your question. Why is this so important to the West Midlands and to me? And it's all about the future of the automotive sector. And then we'll talk about one or two other sectors in a moment as well. We know that automotive has been, the bedrock of the West Midlands economy actually for decades now. And we've actually in the 2010s seen a good resurgence of the automotive industry in the West Midlands. But it is going to go through vast change. We know it's going to be electrified. So for us to have a really dynamic industry in, let's say, 20, 30 years' time, we have got to go electric. And to go electric means we've got to make the batteries that will form the basis of the new cars. Batteries, I learned some years ago, are about 40% of the value of the car. That may change with technology moving on. And so put very simply, if you are not producing 40% of the value, you're going to have a pretty big disadvantage. And that's why we've said it's really important that manufacturing capability is established in the West Midlands.
Thank you very much. That's a very good introduction. Sets the scene. Tell me about the impact on employment that you foresee from a Gigafactory, because obviously, as we're coming out of this awful crisis, a lot of people are worried about their job security, and automotive does employ a lot of people in our region.
Yes, so the automotive direct employment in the region is about 45,000 people. So it's a huge sector in the region. And then, of course, there's the supply chains well beyond it. Slight indulgence, but I went to a chocolate shop in Knoll a couple of years ago, and I learnt the reach of the automotive industry. And so I said to this chocolatier, as he called himself, wonderful job, I said, who's your biggest customer? And he said, JLR, i.e. they make the chocolates that you get when you make a top-end purchase from JLR. And it just sort of all struck me that the automotive industry has an incredible reach in places you wouldn't expect in this region. So right to your question though, Margot, number of direct jobs from the Gigafactory, we are estimating at about 4,000 new jobs. And we're talking about in the immediate supply chain around that, probably about another 10,000 further. But I honestly don't think that's the full extent of the question. The way I see it is those 45,000 jobs are over the long term dependent upon a successful electrification. So you could argue that almost every job in the West Midlands in automotive is indirectly linked to our future of the battery factory. But 4,000 is the headline number that we're quoting.
Thank you very much. Now, I know that Coventry Airport has been identified as the site for the West Midlands, the optimum site for a gigafactory. Can you go into any reasons as to why you selected Coventry?
Yeah,
and the airport in particular?
Yeah, of course. This is a very important question. So let's just go back one stage in the sort of story here. So the first thing we had to do was to get government to actually commit to this as a whole. And in the spending review last autumn, they committed to £500 million to effectively support bids for Gigafactory. So once that funding is open, we then need to have our place to make the bid. We were already working on it before last autumn, but you see, that's why the timing has now come out of the announcement of that particular location. Now, in terms of why Coventry first and then why that particular site, it's really that Coventry sits amidst the cluster that is being developed for electrified automotive. Your own organisation, Margot, is perhaps the brains of that cluster, the biggest automotive research centre anywhere in Europe. And what we're seeing is final manufacturers, think about London Electric Vehicle Company, think about Lotus just making their decision in a slightly different sector, but electric motorcycles, Norton making their decision to bring production to Solihull from the East Midlands. So that whole cluster is set up, and we wanted our Gigafactory site to be right in the midst of the cluster. It's not just about immediate, of course, it will serve all of the West Midlands, but concentrated on that cluster in Coventry. And then why the airport? Well, that was very straightforward. There was a sort of search for sites. There are very few that are big enough. It's a huge site, and it has to have really good access by road, of course, or bringing in materials. And it also has, and of course, by rail, and we could create a railhead there should we choose to. And of course, it has to have access to the national grid to bring in power at the appropriate level, and that's also been done. So there were some specifics about the site set in the context of Coventry's a great city for this.
Thank you, Andy. That was a very comprehensive answer. Let me ask you a question now. We've had a few questions ahead of the session. First one I'm going to ask you is from James Charlotte, who is joining us from Consilium Recruit, and they do some work for the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre and WMG. So welcome, James. And James wants to know, really, now that the government has allocated funding for some of the cost of a gigafactory, when do you envisage a gigafactory actually becoming a reality? And although you've touched on some of the stakeholders in your previous answers, if you could update James on any other developments with stakeholders, that would be good too. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, James, thank you very much. Great question. So you're right, the government's put £500 million aside, as I said, and is looking for applications. The application needs an actual manufacturer of batteries. And so in terms of stakeholders, that is exactly that they are the next target. And what the announcement 2 weeks ago was all about was saying to international stakeholders, this is the site we would like you to develop. So the conversations with those stakeholders are being led by the Department for International Trade, because they are, of course, on behalf of the UK as a whole. They're ongoing, and I'm hoping that the next stage will be wooing one of those investors. The other reason for getting on with the announcement was, of course, trying to shorten the whole lead time from where we are now to those investors making their commitment with government building the place, and we need to shorten the planning timeframe, and that's why Coventry Airport, the City Council are now working together on those planning pieces, almost at risk, before we get that other stakeholder on board. If you ask me when all this can come together through a finished piece, it's quite a long lead time. It's probably 2024, 2025. But what I'm absolutely clear on is if we don't start making those early moves now, we will fall behind, and that's why we've got to act. Hope that's clear, James.
Great stuff, thank you. And I now have another question from Dr. Charles Tennant in Leamington Spa. And he's looking even further ahead, saying that the demand for UK electric vehicle for batteries may well outstrip the supply coming from, he's assuming there's going to be 2 gigafactories in the next few years. And in this case, how do we think that the battery output during those early phases will best be allocated? We're looking ahead slightly with this question, and so something of a hypothetical question, but I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because it talks to the real sort of conundrum here, which is all the experts, of which I'm not one, by the way, Charles, say that, as your question implies, in time there may be demand for 7 or 8 gigafactories in the UK. Now, that is assuming all automobile production has to be electric. And remember, the government have made the rule that post 2030, petrol and diesel cars will be banned. But I think it also begins to talk another very interesting aspect of this, which other sectors might use the batteries from these factories. So domestic energy storage, for example, a huge sector. So we've got this tantalizing piece about 7 or 8, but then the conundrum is you can't get the first one off the ground because the demand is so very small at the moment, because we're right at the beginning of this technological change. So what the answer to this has to be is the government saying, to get the sort of flywheel started, there will be a subsidy from their, I think you're right. The first 2 are what are in sort of minds at the moment. And if you read the small print of what the government said when they announced this in the autumn, they talked potentially about the West Midlands and the North East. There was a very unsubtle clue there. And so I think their thinking is that the current funding is sufficient for 2. That gets the viability question dealt with. But in time, you're absolutely right. If things go as expected, we will probably need many more. And there certainly aren't the resources for building the many more as yet. But it's getting sufficient demand for the first 2 so that they become viable is the critical unlocker.
Thank you, Andy. To that end, how significant do you think the most recent announcements from Jaguar Land Rover have been in this respect? Because the new chief executive, Thierry Bolloré, has conducted a strategic review. He's absolutely lost no time since he joined the company in September last year, and he's made a number of critical few weeks. I wonder what your view of all that was.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, Margot? I think it's hugely significant, not just to the Gigafactory story, but to the whole economy of the West Midlands, frankly. And I think the most important thing he said in all of that strategic review, which, like you, I was full of admiration for, actually, for a new chief executive to come in and so quickly pin his colours to the mast, I did think was impressive. And I've talked to him individually about it, and I sense in him huge confidence in what he said. But the most significant thing was, of course, he made his commitment to full electrification, which needs a gigafactory. But he actually talked about the amount of cash that was going to need to be invested to make this journey. And he talked about an annual cash investment of £2.5 or £3 billion. I mean, it is an eye-watering sum of money. And I'm sure I'm right in saying, if they achieve that, that would comfortably make them the biggest private sector investor in technology in Britain. So it is an enormous target, and it's so significant to the region if that is happening, and they're investing in all of that supply chain here. So I thought it was mouth-watering, really. But again, similar sort of answer as the previous question. Getting from where they are now to where they want to be is one hell of a journey. And how you do that, managing your cash flow alongside the technological changes, that's really hard. But I was full of admiration for it, actually, Margot.
Thank you, Andy. I absolutely agree with that, and so am I. I want to move on to a slightly different angle. I have a question here from Sharon Reed, who's in the property investment sector. And she is asking about all the existing jobs that a gigafactory might save, and the new jobs that you were talking about, Andy. And Sharon is wondering whether there's going to be enough housing to accommodate the growth in workers that a gigafactory might portend.
How very interesting. Okay, how very interesting. That's a really, what's the word, optimistic question, isn't it? You're obviously thinking of great things. So I think the answer's yes, actually. So let me explain why I say that. I think what the question draws out is something that's been a truism in the West Midlands over the last 4 years, that actually good economic growth goes absolutely hand in glove with investing in the infrastructure and invest in housing at the same time. One sort of drives the other. And if you just look pre the pandemic, and I accept we've had a horrible knock over the last 12 months, but the numbers pre-pandemic are really interesting. The region had grown 25% in 5 years, best in the country in terms of economic growth. And at the same time, we had doubled the number of houses being built every year over the last 5 years, that was. And actually that number, we only got this data last week, has actually held up during the pandemic. The housing sector has been one of the most resilient. So what it is telling us is actually that demand for housing was actually helped, partly driven by the success of the economy, people moving in, some people perhaps earning a little more, having more spending money for homes, was actually driving the viability of housing schemes. And combine that with our own approach of insisting on the redevelopment of brownfield schemes, that was actually really helping the whole virtuous circle. So I think actually the way the question should best be answered is actually if we are successful over the Gigafactory, it will put demand into the housing market, which will actually drive the supply. And certainly in Coventry, where we've seen good supply of housing in recent years, that appears to be a good virtuous circle.
Thank you. And now Sharon's got another question as well. I'm not quite, I don't know whether you will have the answer to this one, but I'll try you anyway.
Try me.
Sharon wants to know if the intention is to close Coventry Airport. There are some smaller businesses that she says, and I think she's local to the area, which are run from there supporting the aviation sector, SMEs and the like. And she's concerned about what's going to happen to those businesses and whether they'll have to close or potentially relocate. What kind of support might there be required for SMEs in the aviation sector?
Yeah, okay. So Sharon, it's an extremely good question, and it's the first one where I can't give you a straight answer, because I'm sure you'll understand me saying it isn't actually directly my responsibility. That has to be answered by Coventry Airport. I know they're very active in all these conversations. If there could be a way that a lot of the airport support services were able to be maintained, I would of course support that. And if that needs some remodeling on the site, of course that would be a brilliant thing to do. And a part of the planning discussions will be about how that is all best done. But I'm sorry, Sharon, I'm not in a position to give a categoric answer about how the space, because it is a private company and they really must answer that question for you, Sharon. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. And that leads me nicely on to Jim Cooper's question. Now, Jim, I'm going to just make the point he makes, because you've really answered the question, actually, that someone else asked a similar question. But Jim Cooper runs an SME called Aeros that does serve the airport at the moment. But he says that they support the factory, the Gigafactory, and they've been expecting redevelopment of the airport site for quite some time. His question was, is there expected to be demand for several of these Gigafactories? And I think you did answer that earlier. If you want to say anything else additional, by all means, otherwise I'll move on. No,
the answer is there is definitely expected to be demand. The trickiness is getting sufficient demand consolidated for the first one, as we're at the early stage of the technological change, as I said earlier on. It's probably worth just saying one more thing, though, on this whole sort of skills that's coming up, because I don't think we've perhaps covered this, and people who are in the area already. What I really want to stress is that these are high quality, cutting edge, sustainable jobs. And it's oh so important to point this, that manufacturing can historically have got the wrong reputation, but actually this is a really high-tech industry where we'll be looking for the chemists, the engineers, the digital people, the IT specialists, all of that to drive this. So I think what we can really look forward to, and of course the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, which was there as the sort of catalyst for all of this. When you go and look at what's actually going on in there, you really see it very practically. We can look at some really exciting new jobs coming to that immediate point.
Great stuff. Well, my next question is about jobs as well, and it's being submitted by Kadim from the FRSA. And he's wanting to know about opportunities for young people. I think we're all acutely aware of how young people have suffered, particularly during this crisis over the last year. So Kadim wants to know about apprenticeships and the likely opportunities for apprenticeships in amongst the skill set that is going to be required for all these new jobs.
Yeah, great question, Kadim, and hello. Yes, there will definitely be new jobs at all levels, frankly. I mean, I'll be slightly provocative in answering this question, as well as thinking about the mass jobs that we talked about, 4,000, and actually I'll come to young people in just a second. There are also a relatively small number of really high tech jobs and some internationally competitive people that we're going to need to make sure they are here. And Margot understands this very well from what the WMG does. This is a competitive race, and we need the best brains in the world here in Coventry leading our case. And actually, if I may be so bold, the announcement from the government that we're expecting in the budget around actually allowing some of these critical, internationally competitive people to come to the UK and lead these new industries, something I think is very, very important, actually. But that's away from your question, Kadim, but I did it almost deliberately to be provocative, because what we also need to do is train lots of young people in the skills that are going to be needed for this. And I'll give you a really practical example of this. Just last Friday, we opened a new facility at Wolverhampton College, which was for 720 youngsters to go through training in electric vehicle maintenance. So fascinating, isn't it? Completely different to the actual production of the battery, but in exactly the same area. There are different jobs because only 3% of mechanics at the moment know anything about electric vehicles. So great, Wolverhampton College have seen this opportunity, have stepped into it with a specific training facility. We will, of course, also need apprenticeships. And of course, the government are going to announce in the budget the increase in the subsidy for apprenticeships. We've got our levy transfer fund, and we'll be encouraging all of these businesses that are going to be in this ecosystem to be taking on apprentices, as you know extremely well, Kadim. But fascinating that we've already got 720 new opportunities in this industry.
Well, that's fantastic news. I didn't know about that, but congratulations to Wolverhampton University for putting that on. That's brilliant news. I want to just actually stay with your remarks about the budget, because somebody who doesn't want me to read their name out has asked whether we should expect any further Gigafactory announcements in the budget tomorrow. And you might use that as an opportunity, Andy, to just talk briefly about the announcements that have been made that I know you're well aware of.
Yeah, so I am not aware or expecting any further Gigafactory announcements in the budget, but as Margot knows from her previous life, mortals like us haven't got a clue what's going to be announced in the budget. So we may be surprised tomorrow. And if the Chancellor stood up and said, here's another X for investment in the electrification of automotive, I would cheer. But I'm not expecting it because, to be really clear, as I said earlier, they announced the funding in the autumn statement. It is there and available, and it's about us putting our bid together for that funding and then making sure it comes to the West Midlands, obviously. But there are other things they could do. I do think actually the increase in the subsidy for apprenticeships, as the last question drew out, is important for this sector. I actually think that at the other end of the sector, I would dearly like to see more money for electric charging infrastructure being pushed out to the regions, because we will again only get people to change their behaviour and come to electric cars if you make that easy. And it's been an area where, to be honest, the government has been pretty slow. So that would be a very welcome announcement in the budget in a different area. And then actually, if there was also further money for R&D around this whole sector, I know Margot would rub her hands, but that's also what I would like to see. But we're not expecting a core announcement of here's more funding for Gigafactory, but it can support the whole industry with a number of moves I'd hope to see.
Thank you. I'm going to insert a cheeky question of my own at this point, because you mentioned the charging infrastructure, which has been a bugbear of mine for a long time. I tried to get that, public money into the charging structure, several years ago when I was a minister in the business department. But what do you think about the regulatory environment and anything that needs to change in terms of garage forecourts and the facilities they make available, because if we're not careful, Tesla will have basically taken up so much space in all these forecourts, and of course their charging equipment doesn't charge other cars. So how do you see the regulatory environment shaping up, as well as the clear need for more charging infrastructure? What about the regulatory environment in which that charging structure operates?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, actually. And I think you might think it's an odd way of answering your question, but I think there's a really big opportunity for the West Midlands here, in that I think there will be a whole almost new industry of regulation and management of the data that comes from electric and indeed autonomous vehicles. Because you think about how the insurance industry will change, you think about how the taxation industry will change with the move away from fuel taxation. So there are definitely going to be big changes in how the whole sort of automotive using a car changes, and the industries and opportunities that will bring. And when I say industry, I mean more businesses. And I think we should be thinking, where's the innovation in those adjacent sectors, and can we lead in that as well? And by the way, if you then take autonomous into it and think about where the data around how people use their vehicles will be, that's there. On the regulation piece that Tesla is taking advantage of, if I'm very honest, Margot, I hadn't thought about the detail of that. But what I would like to see, and you might say I am biased here, I would like to see this almost like a public service being provided. And actually the West Midlands Combined Authorities put a proposal together to be a part public, part private piece, where we would provide mega charging facilities at high traffic density places, very rapid, and trying to actually move it away from the control of one company in the way in which you've described it. Almost like making it almost like a public good, like you might say the national grid is, but with private provision in it as well.
Right, thank you.
Early days.
You've got some great ideas there, and I look forward to us getting our teeth into those issues. They are, they've got to be solved alongside everything else that's going on towards electrification.
Right.
I've now got a question from Steve Slavinsky. And he's asking about public transport. When will the airport get a good public service provided? As when Chewy had it as an airport, it was impossible to get there via public transport. And if we think about all those thousands of direct jobs that you were talking about, we obviously don't want to ruin the environmental gains from the Gigafactory by having everybody piling up in a massive car park. So what about the public transport implications, Andy, of that site?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I hope the questioner will acknowledge, I hope clear that I am a huge believer in public transport, actually, mostly because of the environmental gain that it brings. And one of the wonderful things, again, pre-pandemic in the West Midlands, is we were seeing increasing use of train, metro and bus, the only region in the country where all three modes were moving up. So that's brilliant. In terms of Coventry, there needs to be improved public transport to the site. And I'm going to talk about an innovation that's coming that I think may be really interesting for you. Because if you take Anstey as another huge employment site on the edge of Coventry, we've tried to do the traditional bus services, but are they well used? No, they are not. So there is a sort of scratch head moment here that everyone says we must have better public transport, then they don't get used well for these new big employment facilities on the edge of the city. So what we are going to be trialling for the whole of the West Midlands in Coventry is what we call, it's a bit of jargon, a demand responsive public transport facility. And it's going to be based on the sort of University of Warwick area. So this may be good news for your employees, Margot. And it's basically like I don't want to overplay it, but it's basically like a minibus service would be you would demand for your own journey. And the clever sort of IT that lies behind it aggregates the journeys, works out how a very efficient route can be taken. So you get what you want, but it's efficient enough because it combines with others. If anyone from London is on the line, it's the sort of city mapper model from London. And we're very we're very close to launching this as a trial for TFWM in Coventry. And I would have thought to the questioner that given this whole angsty problem of not enough people using it on the edge of city locations, that might be the solution for the whole battery factory site, certainly when we're going through the early stages of employment there.
Right, thank you. That was a most interesting answer. I'd now like to turn to an interesting question that we've got from Vishwanath Panyam. Vishwanath is from Oxbridge Analytics and Consultants, and he wants to know how SMEs can be part of this growth story. And I think you mentioned earlier, Andy, the importance of the supply chain as a raison d'etre for the whole gigafactory to be sited in Coventry in the first place, because of the quality of the supply chain. But obviously that supply chain will be changing. So, you know, what could SMEs hope for out of all this, do you think?
One word: success. Maybe second word: wealth. You never know. We're allowed to say that in business, aren't we? But it's a critical point, Margot and Vish. Thank you for your question. I think we're already beginning to see this. So if you think of the decisions taken by Lotus, taken by Norton, they've come to the West Midlands because they see that supply chain of SMEs, let's be clear about it, really emerging. And of course, you again get a different type of virtuous circle than I've talked about earlier on, because actually the presence of those companies, and obviously JLR is the biggest, but also the LEVC, they are using their procurement power to develop, to buy from those SMEs, which in turns develop the strength of that supply chain. So I think it is happening, and we're actually seeing an incredible number of startups in this electrified and automotive area as well. So actually, Vish, it is happening, and it's very difficult to be precise in the advice, but I think what you've got to do is you've got to look at the technological innovations that's happening with those ultimate manufacturers, and indeed look at what's going on in the research organisations and think about how they can be commercialised. And both Margot's organisation and the MTC are acting as the sort of catalyst for that process happening. But Margot, I'm not trying to pass the buck, but you would be very welcome to answer this question, because you know more about this than I do, I know.
Yes, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll get round to answering the question in a few minutes after I've asked you a few real questions.
I didn't get away with that. Okay, go on. All right.
I told you earlier, it's a pleasure to be on this side of the table.
Yeah, go on.
Right, well, I've got a question now, which I think is absolutely critical. It's from Dominic Richardson. How would you incentivize a tenant to manufacture a gigafactory in the long term? I think what Dominic's getting at is how do we attract the expert investor to actually build the gigafactory?
Yeah, it is the critical question, because ultimately this is a private company's decision as to whether they're going to invest. So what are we going to do to get them to say yes? And by the way, I'm sure you know this, Dominic, there's not 101 people it can be. The number of people doing this in the world is, you know, if I said a dozen serious competitors, that's probably about right. It's probably more, but you know, the point I'm trying to make is there's a relatively small pool, and we've got to get them to make a critical investment here rather than say in France or Germany or anywhere else. So how do you do that? Now I've sat in front of some of these companies in China, actually. I went out with a team and had some experience of this. And the word they did not ask, first of all, was incentivize, in the sort of narrow sense of that word. The word they asked was, what's the demand? Prove to me that this is going to be needed. And they've got all their projections. So actually, the single most important thing to answer your question is a company like JLR saying, we're going full electric, we need this level of demand. And that's what they have said. Now, clearly, they've got to specify their exact products, and there's a whole process there. But actually, the first thing is level of demand. The second thing is all the stuff around the costs of operating, because JLR say to me, and we've got to have a gigafactory that's competitive. We can't. So that's the cost of land, the cost of labour, the cost of electricity. So all of those things are being worked on in the business case. And then the third element of it, and it is third in rate of import, is actually the incentive or the subsidy that or support, whatever word you want to use, that the government would put in. And something will be needed. Any successful gigafactory setup, I think anywhere in the world, maybe not the Tesla one, but almost anything else, not the Tesla one in the States, but certainly when Tesla came to Berlin, has had some degree of public sector support, government support, but it can only follow the fundamentals of the business case, as I've just described, being right. And this is why I think the time is now right, because we're seeing our manufacturers make these commitments, which gives the confidence to the suppliers. Hope
Absolutely.
That
I think that's an excellent answer there for Dominic Richardson. Thank you, Andy. I think we've probably only got time for one more question, because I know that you're on a tight schedule, Andy. And this last question is from Bhaskar Tota. I do hope I've pronounced your name right, Bhaskar. And it's a great question to end on, I think, because again, it's looking ahead. The next wave of technology, potentially complementary to battery, is fuel cells for HGVs and rail and the larger vehicles.
Correct.
Have you any plans to focus it on this at any point down the line?
Yeah, okay. It's fascinating question, actually. And you're right, Margot, it's a great one to finish on because it sort of illustrates the point. We can see the use of this technology in, I call them domestic cars. But there are many other aspects that this technology will be used on. So, of course, freight vehicles, people who know a lot more about the science than I will explain the challenge here. The power to weight ratio makes it much more difficult for this technology to be applied for the heavier vehicles, but it will come as batteries become more efficient. It's also now being looked at in rail. You're absolutely right. And there is a wonderful organisation based just down the road in Southam called Viva Rail, who is looking at battery-powered trains. So yes, we have that in the West Midlands. And of course, the Prime Minister talks in his very ebullient mode about jet zero. So how is this used in airplanes? Now, that I think is at the moment pretty fanciful, but it's right that Britain begins to look at that. But what I think this illustrates is, going back to the very first question, why this is so important to be in this technology, because it will be used in so many other applications in the future. And it's an area that's not claimed international leadership yet. And I genuinely think, partly because of the brains we've got around this, that we can do it. And by the way, as I said earlier, it won't just be around transport technologies. The whole of domestic energy, which if you think of the net zero piece, domestic energy and heating is a third of our emissions. We need to apply this technology in that sector as well. So great question, lots of it, but we've got to get this first piece of the jigsaw in place right now.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. Have we time for one more?
Go on, one more.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, because Steve Slavinsky has come up with another question about the Blythe power station that is proposed by the startup up there. And they're planning to build, according to Steve, at the start building at the end of this year, summer 2021. Anyway, he wanted to know where we were with the planning issues between Coventry Council and Coventry Airport. You might have something to say about the planning issues up in Blythe. I know you're not standing for election up there, but it assumes a rather swift planning cycle up in Blythe. The question from Steve Smolinski.
Well, Steve, I hope this isn't cheeky. I have looked at the site in Blythe from the air, a picture from the air. I think it'd be fair to say their planning issues are a little less complex than ours in terms of the nature of the land. And I don't want to be in any way dismissive of the North East as a place, but, you know, the value of the land there in Coventry and everything around it is rather different, actually, to what we see up there. But I think there's an important point here. There's been a lot said about British Volt. Let's believe it when we see it. In a sense, good luck to them. But they've got their own obstacles to move through as well. And as yet, nobody neither us nor them has given an absolutely cast iron guarantee. So just remember that. In terms of the planning issues here, the good thing is the airport and the City Council, and indeed supported by Warwickshire and Warwick District, really important that they're called out as well. They are now all working together at speed, at risk, to clear the planning issue, so we can say to these international investors, we're ready, waiting, this is a great place to go. And I think it's incredibly positive that they're all prepared to do that at some risk. Indeed, the private owner as well.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. That really is all we've got time for. I want to thank everybody for joining, everyone who sent questions in, participated during the whole event with the chat bar. But most of all, I want to thank Andy for giving us his time this morning. It's clear from what he said that there is all to play for, that we've got the skills, we've got the supply chain, we've got the biggest investor in the automotive sector, JLR, on Andy's patch, and we've got the brains, and we've got the teamwork, what Andy was talking about with all the stakeholders, so often at loggerheads on different issues. They're all at one on this one. And it's great that we've got the Mayor's support. And if I might just say, I'm so impressed with the level of detailed knowledge you have on this, Andy, because obviously you've got an awful lot across the West Midlands to look after. And it's hugely impressive that you're so confident and knowledgeable about this one, albeit huge issue and opportunity for the West Midlands. All the very best, Andy. Thank you for your time today. And thank you all. I've really enjoyed chairing the session.
Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.